This again is the Topics in Ancient World History course. I'm Dr. Young. I want to talk for just a few minutes here about what civilization is, and then discuss very briefly some of the earliest civilizations. The textbook will have a lot of details about these. I don't want to go into all of those details. The point of this is not to replicate what's in the textbook, but rather just to kind of supplement and focus that, right? And so, what's the definition of civilization? Well, obviously, civilizations arise between, say, 4000 BCE and 2000 BCE. And these happen, or these occur in different parts of the world. They correspond, or rather they're the result, we might say, of the agricultural revolution, which we discussed briefly last time. Agriculture brings people together, allows them to settle permanently in places, produces things like villages and eventually towns and cities. And scale is a big part of what we mean by civilization, right? This is a large-scale human society with a corresponding culture. That is, there's a form of social organization and perhaps even government and law and things like that, but then a culture that goes along with it where people are thinking about their situation, right, and producing things in the form of things like literature and art and eventually philosophy and such, right, that ponders the conditions they're living in. And of course, there's an economy that's part of this. Civilization does not mean a unified area necessarily in a kind of governmental or political sense, right? Some of these earliest civilizations, in fact, are hardly unified. They're fighting constantly among themselves. But there is a shared culture and perhaps a shared economy, because even those people who fight against each other can also tend to trade with each other, perhaps even simultaneously while they're fighting. And so scale is important, but the kind of the shared society and culture on a large scale is really what we mean by civilization. There are 5 civilizations that come into being between around 4000 BCE and around 2000 BCE in 5 regions of the world. They're listed here, right? The Fertile Crescent, which stretches between the Persian Gulf on the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant region, which is the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. I'll show you a map of that in a couple of minutes here. The Nile Valley, which it could be said is just an extension of the Fertile Crescent, except the Nile Valley is isolated from that by some geographic barriers. And the Nile Valley develops an independent civilization. It's really quite different from that of the Fertile Crescent. So we'll talk about the contrast between those two in a little bit here. Third civilization comes into being in the Indus Valley in what is now the border of Pakistan and India. The upper image here is of the city of Mohenjo-Daro, which around 3000 BCE or so already had a population somewhere approaching 50 to 100,000 people. And it was standardized. There were only 2 widths of street in that city, 33 feet wide, I believe, and 9 feet wide, or something like that. There was obviously a great deal of planning and social organization that went into this, indicating the complexity and the care that people were taking of that civilization, right? So that's another very early and very successful civilization. The Yellow River Valley in China, which is the northern major river. There are 2 kind of major watersheds in China. The Yangtze is the southern one, and then the Yellow River on the north. The Yellow River is the site of the earliest civilization in China. This was primarily a wheat-growing area. The rice cultivation that would come to characterize civilizations in East Asia would be developed later along the Yangtze and then spread to other parts of East Asia from there. And then finally, sometime around 2500 to 2000 BCE, we have in Central America, what is now kind of southern Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, stretching down into the other parts of Central America, the Olmec civilization, as it's called. The most compelling evidence they leave behind are these massive carved stone heads that you can see in the image on the slide here. And so this is another large-scale civilization, very early, and an interesting one, but one that we know certainly less about than we would like, and that's true for all of these, right? We have been able to decipher the writing of some of these civilizations, but not necessarily all of it. All of these civilizations did have written forms of communication, and that is another key feature of this, right? As we mentioned in the last lecture, the last video, writing really starts history proper, because to understand the society and the culture at a deep level, it really helps to have written evidence, right? And so we begin to have written evidence in places like the Fertile Crescent in Egypt around 4000 BCE or so, and that gives us insight into these, that, even though the art and the material remains and such are very compelling, and archaeologists and scholars of art and others, right, have done great things with this. Once we have writing, we can start to corroborate the material and the artistic evidence with the writing, to give us a much fuller picture of what these places are. I do want to discuss a couple of points about two of these very early civilizations, the Fertile Crescent civilization and the Nile Valley civilization, and to draw a contrast between them, because one of the factors that helps to shape a civilization is its physical environment, right? And we're going to look at some primary source evidence from both of these early civilizations in what we call the Bronze Age, and I'll talk about what that is in a little bit, or probably in the next video. But the Bronze Age runs from about 3000 BCE to about 1000 BCE. It's called the Bronze Age because the main medium for making tools, as well as art, is the metal called bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin with some kind of bonding agent, usually arsenic, to kind of bind the two metals together in a chemical reaction. And they use bronze for everything, right? For weapons, for tools, for decoration, and so forth and so on, for building material, even ornamentation of buildings and such. Okay. And so both Egypt and Mesopotamia, as it's called here, the Fertile Crescent region, have bronze during that period. We're going to look at primary source evidence, and one of the things that I want to note here is the influence of the physical environment on the society and the culture, right? Mesopotamia, as it's called, runs between these two rivers. In fact, the word Mesopotamia in Greek, it means the land between two rivers. The two rivers are the Euphrates and the Tigris. They flow from the Caucasus region. I've got the pointer out here, which is up here between the Caspian and the Black Seas, which are off. The Black Sea's over here. Caspian Sea's over here. Further east is the Aral Sea into Central Asia, right? But this region is called the Caucasus region. They flow out of these Caucasus Mountains down to the Persian Gulf, which they dump into, right? And the civilization stretches over into this region called the Levant, with Phoenicia and Palestine and ancient Israel and places like that, which we'll talk about. But these rivers really help to shape the civilization. One of the things about the rivers is that they flooded a lot. They flooded in ways that were unpredictable and destructive. And so natural disasters were a common occurrence. Moreover, the various city-states, now a city-state, this is an important term, right? A city-state is a population center with all of the farmland and things that surround it. These tend to form social and political units in ancient Mesopotamia. It was actually rare for this area to be unified. It happens a couple of times. We'll talk about Sargon the Great, as he's called, from Sumer down here close to the Persian Gulf. He unifies kind of southern Mesopotamia in the 24th century BCE. And then Hammurabi, who's from Babylon right here, he manages to conquer much of the Fertile Crescent, really kind of all of Mesopotamia, in the 18th century BCE. But normally these city-states function as independent social and political units, and they fought constantly with each other because the resources really were quite scarce, right? I mean, the land is fairly abundant, but the best land, the land closest to the rivers, the land that was out of the floodplain, that wasn't constantly getting destroyed, right? This is relatively scarce, and they're fighting over this. They're fighting over other resources with each other, right? So The natural disasters and the constant warfare are the things that help to shape Mesopotamian civilization. As a result of this, the culture seems to be, or rather the political situation seems to be very authoritarian. Those who could dominate and control the military tended to be in charge. And also, gather together the greatest number of resources, the best farmland, the precious metals, and other things that were valued. But the society was quite militaristic, it seems. The warriors were prized. But merchants also had a lot to do here because, even though these city-states are fighting against each other, they're also trading with each other. This is necessary for survival. And so merchants were the ones who developed the first writing. And we'll talk about that as we discuss some of these texts later on. Okay. The kind of culture that takes shape here corresponds with this focus on death and destruction, right? The gods of the ancient Mesopotamians tend to be very vengeful characters, capricious characters. The outlook they have on life, and especially the afterlife, is pretty grim, at least from the surviving written evidence we have. So life was short and harsh and often painful, right? And people tended to die of starvation or get caught in floods or get killed in wars. And so the pessimistic view was pretty common. Now, one of the things, though, that Mesopotamia did well was to innovate. They had to. The geographic situation and the constant warfare and things like that forced them to innovate if they were going to survive. And so they developed, among other things, this complex irrigation system, including canals and runoff channels and gates and things like that to stop the floods from being so destructive, to channel the flood waters into places where they wouldn't do so much damage, where they weren't going to destroy homes and farms and those sorts of things. And warfare innovation as well. The Mesopotamians were pretty good at innovating in that respect. They, developed different kinds of weapons and different kinds of warfare tactics that at least those who controlled those, it gave them a pretty serious advantage over other people. Now, contrast that with Egypt. Okay, Egypt, ancient Egyptian civilization took shape, I should say, in the Nile Valley. This is a satellite image of Egypt. And you can see this lush green band, looks like a ribbon, right, flowing here. It flows south to north. It comes together around what is now the city of Khartoum in the Sudan. There's the Blue Nile, which flows out of the Ethiopian highlands over here, and then the White Nile, which comes out of Lake Victoria all the way in Central Africa down here. And they come together and then flow into this lower Nile Valley. And this is where ancient Egyptian civilization happened. This was among the most favored locations for human civilization in the world. It's isolated, it's protected, right? To the east, we have the Sinai Peninsula and a really dry desert, lots of mountains. It's difficult. You can see the southern tip of the Fertile Crescent over here. You can see the green there, right? But to try to get from there to there meant crossing a desert and a lot of mountains. And so the people of Egypt really didn't feel threatened greatly. Of course, to the west, we got the Sahara Desert and really kind of nothing out there. To the south, we have a series of rapids along the Nile that make traverse of the Nile River itself difficult. And so if conquest was going to go anyway, it was going to go from the lower Nile Valley here down into the south, into the Sudan region, or Nubia as it was called anciently. Though later on, it's going to come the other direction, right? So this place was relatively isolated and protected from invasion. And the people who lived there also had the advantage of the Nile flooding predictably. The monsoon rains in equatorial Africa happen at the very same time, roughly every year. This is part of the greater kind of Indian Ocean basin monsoon rains. And then the monsoon flood would sort of make its way down the Nile. Down means north. And it would overflow its banks gradually, dump this nice fertile soil that was coming from the Great Rift Valley in the Ethiopian highlands, some of the most fertile soil in the world down here, right? Overflowing the banks of the Nile, dumping onto the surrounding farmland, and giving the Egyptians ideal conditions to plant crops in. They got an abundance of food out of it. They only got one crop a year, but it was enough to supply their needs, right? Is it any wonder then that the Nile Valley, because of this isolation, protection, and this excellent agricultural condition, produced one of the most stable societies, probably the most enduring society in terms of just longevity in world history? For fully 2,000 years, the Nile Valley existed under the same political system. They were ruled by a ruler named the Pharaoh, or called the Pharaoh. That was his title. He was a god on earth, it was believed. Called so, or rather people accepted that because, everything was good in Egypt, and they need to credit someone, and the Pharaoh tended to take credit for it. People believed he was a god, or she. There were a few female pharaohs too. And so we have this incredibly stable situation in Egypt as opposed to the situation in the Fertile Crescent, which was less than stable. However, if there is a disadvantage to this, and I don't want to put too fine a point on that because Egyptian civilization was incredibly enduring, but Egypt did not innovate a great deal. Over 2,000 years, the civilization that existed in 3000 BCE when the pharaohs first started ruling was very similar to the what it looked like in, say, 1200 BCE. And so, this is one of the downfalls, I guess, it kind of in the long run, in the long term for Egypt, is they didn't innovate a great deal. They didn't worry too much about military innovation and those sorts of things. And they were eventually conquered by a succession of empires in the Iron Age, which we will discuss at a later date. So I think that I want to end it there. Yeah, there are a few other things we can say about this, but I'll go ahead and pick that up in the next video. All right, thanks.